Hello, Buzzkillers. It is time, and I mean time, for another Professor Buzzkill history podcast. And there's no one better to talk to about time than Dr. Rebecca Struthers, who's written a wonderful new book called Hands of Time, which is gripping reading because it is a watchmaker's history, not just a history of watches and time and chronology and all that sort of stuff, but the history and, reflections and study of her role as a watch repairer and a watchmaker. So, Dr. Struthers, thank you so much for coming on the show, for making time to come on the show. And that's the last
No,
pun I'll
thank you
make.
so much for having me. There's so many time puns out there. It's hard not to.
Yeah. Well, as you rightly point out early on in the book, we time is the most common noun in the English language. I'm running out of time. I need extra time. Blah 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 blah. We never really stop, especially in these days of Apple watches and all these fancy Garmin watches and things like that, to think anymore about the older ways of measuring time. And the book goes through an awful lot of that, but also, and thankfully, because I'm a 19th century person, I like this sort of mechanical things. It's mainly, of course, about watches and mechanical time. What brought you to watchmaking, watch repairing? Well, the study of watches? After all, you're the first person to get a PhD in horology, and then to write the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a kind of a fortuitous journey, really. So I didn't set out to do this. It was actually
Mm-hmm.
not until I'd already kind of left school and started studying elsewhere that I even discovered that this was a profession. So I had been to a very academic school. And yeah, you kind of push towards the sciences as a serious subject for study, and the arts were more of a hobby, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always loved both. So I really struggled with that. And I ended up taking very science led exams just to find that, yeah, it just wasn't me. And I actually dropped out of school before I finished and ran off to art school, where I started studying jewelry and silversmithing. And yeah, it just so happened to be that this place was down the road from where I live. So that's how I'd heard about it. And I went away and started that. And it was while doing jewelry and silversmithing that I developed an interest for very basic automata, so moving pieces, articulated pieces. And the same college I was at taught horology, watch and clock making. And some of their students spotted my work at one of the end of year shows and asked if I'd ever considered being a watchmaker. And at that point, no, I thought watchmaking was changing batteries or adjusting bracelets in a local shopping mall. I didn't realize there's anything more to it than that. And yeah, how wrong I was. So yeah, they invited me to their workshop and I had a look around, and it was just this epiphany moment for me. I was like, yeah, this is it. This is what I want to do the rest of my life now. I'm an artist, I'm a designer, and I'm an engineer and a physicist, and everything rolled into one, and a historian as well. It's such a
Mm.
beautifully diverse subject. So yeah, I started out doing 3 years practice, followed by several more years part-time doing various. I did a master's degree after that, and yeah, then the my PhD. So I was the first watchmaker to do a PhD in horology in the UK. And still currently
Right.
owning. So if there are any British watchmakers listening to this, interested by some miracle, that is a challenge. I'd love there to be more.
Well, I just always sort of assume, and I guess I'm like most people, I assume that, with all these, I have an Apple Watch, and with all these mechanical, electronic watches now since the late 70s, I guess, I'm still always surprised at the attraction in contemporary life to actual mechanical watches. A lot of them are, of course, extreme status symbols, but they're also fascinating, much more fascinating than an electronic watch. As an expert in this field, do you get a sort of professional high as you walk through, duty-free shops and places, and you see all these fancy watches, and you think that the craft is still alive?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point for the industry, actually. So, I mean, my specialist area is the vintage and antique stuff. So, I started out in restoration before I started making my own watches, and we still do a lot of restoration. So, yeah, I like the old stuff with the stories.
Hmm.
But yeah, so we went through something called the quartz crisis in the 1970s and 80s, which was assumed at the time to be the death of the mechanical wristwatch. And yeah, it very nearly was in some ways, but it actually ended up kind of saving the mechanical industry in one way, because it's the Swatch, our cheap and cheerful, colourful plastic swatches, that ended up being such a success that the Swatch group bought in all these other mechanical watch brands and reformed the industry in an incredible way. And there was almost a similar fear when smartwatches came out, that this, again, it's like the quartz crisis all over again. It'll be the death of the mechanical watch. Interestingly, if anything, it's kind of been the opposite is true. I mean, I started out doing this, now it's 20 years this year. I started out in this industry, and the pre-owned market is stronger than it's ever been. There's a huge demand for sort of independent watches, and like, it's really strong demand. And I think smartwatches in a way have kind of got a whole new generation of people who'd stopped wearing watches because we don't need a watch. We've got phones, we've got computers, we don't need them anymore. And by creating it something kind of more contemporary tech based, it's got people wearing watches who never wore them before. So these already weren't our clients in a way. And now they're wearing watches. It's kind of got them thinking about what else they can do with that, what other watches are available. And now that's kind of a huge growing market of new people starting in smartwatches and venturing out into mechanical watches as they discover this whole new world.
Yes, and one of the things I learned immediately while reading the book was that what I had thought was a strange term that Apple used for the little things that you could put on the face of the watch, of the Apple Watch, were called complications. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Why would Apple want to have a simpler word than, you don't want to make the watch complicated? But I learned that from you that's what they've always been called. All multi-dial watches or watches with dates on, all those little extra things are called complications. Do you know why that was the case?
Yeah, so a complication is anything that goes above and beyond the watch's ability to tell the time. So a basic complication is something as simple as your date, aperture, date indication on the dial, and then it can go all the way up to kind of you're repeating watches. So they're watches with little gongs inside that can chime out the minutes and quarters and hours, to split-second chronographs, so you can do lap timing, interval timing on them, to perpetual calendars that can accurately maintain the right numbers of days in the month, of varying month lengths over years and years and years, hundreds of years, some of them. They are complicated. And from a watchmaker's perspective, they definitely make the watch a lot more complicated to design and also to repair and maintain as the years go by. So they are quite literally a mechanical complication.
Yeah, but I like the fact that I'd like to hear from someone at Apple. So then, please, at Apple, email me info@Professor Buzzkill. You obviously deliberately decided to keep that word, complications. They could have called it anything, apps, widgets, whatever. And they didn't. They call it complications. Now, let's dive into the history of watches, because to me, the wristwatch seems to be, the pocket watch and the wristwatch seem to be the most, convenient inventions ever. It's an amazing thing to have. It's an amazing thing to tote around. When, generally speaking, do we sort of switch from standing clocks in the house, mantle clocks in the house, to having watches as well?
Mechanical timekeepers are one of the most efficient machines ever made too, which is another thing that still blows my mind. The first mechanical watch, the oldest one that we know about, was made in around 1505.
Wow.
So it's over 500 years old now. And that's the first kind of portable mechanical timepiece that you could wear on your body. And that would have been worn around the neck at the time. But wristwatches were around for almost a similar length of time, possibly. So the earliest evidence that we have of what might be a wristwatch was described in a wardrobe inventory of Elizabeth I. So this is, again, 16th century. And unfortunately, it hasn't survived. Right. So we'll not know for sure, but it was described as being a clock worn on the arm, which in itself sounds kind of, surely that's what a watch is. It's basically a small clock worn on your arm in an armlet made out of gold and covered in rubies and diamonds. So incredible sounding thing, but didn't survive. And for the first few centuries of their existence, wristwatches were actually considered as a women's jewelry accessory.
Right.
So men wore pocket watches, women wore pocket watches and wristwatches. And it wasn't until the turn of the 20th century that you get wristwatches start to become commercialized for men. And that was after, we believe, the kind of popularity of something called sweethearts watches, which started out during the Boer War, where women would gift these small silver fob watches. They were really fashionable at the time for women to wear, usually around a chain on their neck or in a brooch on their chest. And they'd gift these watches to their loved one, to their husband, their partner, as they went away for war, with a promise that they would return their watch to them when they came home safely. And to keep these watches safe, men started making leather cup strap conversions so they could strap them to their wrists to kind of keep them close at all times. And it was through doing this that they realized that actually, when you're in the heat of battle, being shot at or crawling around in trenches, that having the time on your wrist as opposed to fumbling around in your pocket to try and figure out what time it is really, really useful. So it maintained being kind of a niche thing. Even by the start of the 20th century, there are records of shipments of wristwatches going out to the US and being returned back to Europe, saying that these are not saleable here, that they'll never catch on. The Levi 501 jeans, the little inner pocket you have on your front hip, that was actually designed for pocket watches. Manly men, to the point of even cowboys, wore pocket watches. That was a thing that real men would wear. And it wasn't actually until the First World War that everything changed.
Yeah.
And it was such an intense part of our history and such a global experience that you go from wristwatches still being relatively niche outside military situations to men coming out of the First World War. And by that point, it was rare for a man not to own a wristwatch. So you get hundreds of years of wristwatches being around. And then in the space of 5-10 years, everything changes with the way that they're worn.
Now, do we know why World War One? Was it something about being in the trenches or being a soldier, or is it because the numbers of soldiers were so much larger than other wars? Once that number of soldiers start wearing watches, then it really does become a cultural phenomenon. But do we know any more? I mean, does the military say, hey, there's really something going on here, we need to make sure everybody wears a watch?
Yeah, well, war is the great inventor and innovator, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was the scale of it and also the increased mechanization of war that was changing things in a huge way. So some of the military tactics used during the First World War, like a creeping artillery barrage, were very dependent on accurate timings. So your friendly fire, they'd lay down cover fire for you while you got out the trench and ran, and there'd be set interval timings where you get down, your side would fire again, they'd stop, you get up, run again until they lay down cover fire. Obviously, you need to know exactly what time that's happening so you don't get shot by your own side. So people needed time. And especially as we started going into sort of aviation and flying, we'd already resolved the longitude problem, which had been the great problem of the 18th century for sailors out at sea. But pilots, again, longitude is a huge, huge issue. And calculating longitude on the move, not really something easy to do with a big clock in your plane, whereas having something small and easy that you can wear on your wrist, massively convenient.
Right.
The way we fought war changed, and reliance on time became increasingly important. And those two things came together to really demonstrate how practical wristwatches were.
And so then, and presumably when the World War I soldiers went home, they brought their watches with them and then found how extremely convenient they were, especially with shift work and things like that. It just must have taken off from there.
In a huge way as well. So the very first wristwatches, commercial wristwatches, we call trench watches because of them being named after their use in trench warfare. And they look quite similar to almost a very small pocket watch, like a fob watch, but with a pair of wire lugs soldered on them so you could thread a leather or canvas strap through. Really simple looking things that kind of almost pebble-like. And that continued until you get sort of out of the war and people are buying more watches, and suddenly you've got all this investment and demand, and a whole market has just appeared for wristwatches in a huge way. And that's when design and innovation and your increasing levels of complexity of wristwatches just skyrockets. So from Elizabeth I, possible, her watch worn on your arm, through to the end of the First World War, very kind of limited development in terms of kind of aesthetic design and styling. And then you get through from Art Deco through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, it just skyrockets of what is achievable within wristwatches. You get the first manual winding. So our automatic watches were invented, chronographs that you could wear on your wrist. So watches that could function as a stopwatch whilst continuing to tell the time. And then you had like your calendar complications. Everything comes off the back of this, and watches are more designed to be something that you wear on your wrist. So you get beautiful case shapes and styles. Their dials get a lot more exciting. My other half is a watchmaker too. We work together. And that's one of our favorite eras for watchmaking, because just there's so much innovation and some mad inventions that never caught on and would ever work as well. But everyone's wanting to be the first, next biggest, brightest thing of doing something new. And it's a really fascinating point in watchmaking history.
Oh, well, then you have to, you can't say a thing like they're mad inventions that never catch on without giving us a few examples.
Some of the names of them are brilliant. So we've got an auto wrist, which was an early form of automatic winding. That would wind itself from the movement of your wrist. Only now we have a weight that swings within the movement, and there's a kind of a pivot, an axle in the middle, and it's geared to wind the spring that powers the watch as it spins round. This one is actually in the lugs. So the lugs, as you flex your wrist, that's the bit that holds the strap on, swing out and wind the watch a teeny tiny bit. And then as you unflex your wrist, the strap comes in again, the lugs come in again, and it releases. And you have to keep flexing your wrist, which, as you can imagine, there aren't many publicly appropriate wrist actions you could do to even get near half wind on that. It's hopeless, but it was a fantastic idea. And there's some of the early waterproof ones. My favorite that I've seen was called a wet wrister, which I just
oh Lordy,
does what it says on the
almost
tin.
dirty.
Yeah. Yeah, things with cork gaskets as well were very commonly used back then, and some just ridiculous case designs. It's really cool. We collect a few of these as well.
Now, do they drop by the wayside just because they're as you say, mad and not very useful and not very effective, or are there some things that had or continue to have on wristwatches that really were silly and people just kept them for fashion? Like I've seen people have like phases of the moon on old watch faces, and I think that must just be purely for decoration. They're not actually trying to think of the phases of the moon.
Yeah, I think the ones that didn't catch on was primarily for the fact that they weren't very good. They weren't very efficient. They were incredibly overcomplicated. Like the number of parts that go into making something that should be so straightforward is ridiculous, and that makes them incredibly hard to repair. They're also usually not made by very famous brands, so they're really obscure things that if you didn't know what you were looking for, you wouldn't know what they were. So yeah, it can be quite hard to find them. That's why they didn't catch on so much at the time. And then as for unnecessary, like you say, moon phase, ironically, is one of my favorite complications. That's another complication. And I think for me, that's because it takes us back to how humans first started discovering the cyclic nature of time itself. So the oldest possible timekeeper we have might be a lunar calendar, and that's 44,000 years old. So that's where I start the book with it. And that we still have watches that can do that for us today, I think is really lovely. And the smartwatches do it too. So
yeah, that's true.
Many of these early timekeeping methods that we used to use tens of thousands of years ago, we can still do on our smartwatch. Yeah, which is pretty cool when you think about it.
Well, when then after the war, so men are coming back. It's mostly a wristwatch at this stage. It's still mostly a male thing. You mentioned that even nurses have the watches sort of pinned to their uniforms, the top part of the uniform. When do watches become more fashionable, or when do wristwatches become more fashionable for women again?
They'd continue to be fashionable for women throughout this time, but it wasn't really, it was an extension of jewelry. But there are kind of key changes around this time too. So with the First World War, you've got a lot more women going into the workplace, and wristwatches again are a lot more practical if you're trying to keep track of the time whilst working. Changes in the way we travel as well. So bicycles, trying to tell the time, trying to pull out a pocket watch while you're cycling around isn't very easy, but wristwatches, perfect. You even get a lot of these early adverts for wristwatches are marketed at the cyclist or the soldier, and they list kind of these different things that we're doing in life now. So for ladies, cycling, that was a huge part too, and working day, and that they were already accustomed to wearing them. So quite a few with sort of trench watch designs. I collect old photographs of people wearing watches too, and you get plenty of women wearing men's, in inverted comma, watches, these trench watches. And I think this is kind of something you get throughout fashion quite a lot, is women seem to be a little, dare I say, faster at kind of embracing men's fashion, wearing the trousers, than men are perhaps at embracing women's fashion, like at the time wearing wristwatches. this is still a really interesting thing that we follow today as well, with how women buy watches and how men buy watches for women, and how brands design watches for women as well. They said we're getting into contemporary
Yeah.
stuff now and kind of gender philosophy and watch design. But to this day, women quite happily wear larger size watches.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
always really entertaining because brands think, oh, this mark of watch is selling well to women. Let's do a half size version, cover it in diamonds. And then they're surprised when it stops selling.
Oh, right. Right.
And it's, so I'm off on a tangent now, but
No. It's great. Well, we haven't really talked about your work as a watch repairer. And of course, you're in the perfect place for it, which is the English Midlands. And there were a number of famous watch companies there in earlier centuries. Please, the Buzzkillers will just love to hear stories of some of the great old watches you've come across and the sort of aesthetic joy of working on them. So please tell us stories. We love these stories.
The most incredible story of a watch that I've handled and worked on recently, I actually used to start my chapter 10, so I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil it, but that was from the Second World War and had been issued to a gunner on a plane, and it had been shot down with its owner, who'd ended up surviving and an incredible ordeal to get back home safely in the end, and had gifted this watch to his son, who brought it into me looking like it had come down
Right.
after being shot out of the sky in a plane, to restore for him to wear it and to pass on to his children now. It's just incredible. It was one of those moments as a historian, kind of, you get these stories, don't you? And they're just too good to be true.
Yeah.
And you're there thinking, oh, this is amazing. Like, I bet I'm going to start doing my due diligence on this and pulling it apart a bit, and nothing will add up, and I'll have to just forget it. And every single thing I fact checked, every single thing, all added up.
Wow.
Perfectly, even down to a son of a celebrity explorer that was present at one of the stages in his Great Escape. Everything was true. And it's just, I still get goosebumps thinking about it now. But things like that are incredible. We love watches with stories. Like, I'm not big on brand names. It doesn't have to be hugely expensive. It's more about the story that goes with it. And I've handled watches that have been in the same family for 250 years. Things with hidden messages, secret engraving inside it, both by watchmakers and by makers, the original maker. Things that have survived here have been on horseback through deserts in the 1920s, and it's pretty cool. And then there's the stuff we get in museums as well. So talk a little bit about Cheapside Hoard, which includes one of my favorite watches.
Now, what is that? What do they mean? What's that mean? Cheapside Hoard.
The Cheapside Hoard was a hoard of Jacobean and Elizabethan jewellery discovered in 1912 in the Cheapside area of London.
Right.
And this was where there were some builders who were renovating one of the buildings. They're digging out a cellar, came across this stash of gold and jewels, enamels, and it nearly didn't make it into the public domain. There was a bit of debate what they were going to do with it, but it did, and it's now housed in the Museum of London collection, so you can go and see it. But one of the most incredible pieces in this collection was a watch that kind of a little pocket watch about the size of a small Satsuma, and it's been carved from a solid piece of Colombian emerald. So the entire case is made from emerald. Yeah, it's incredible. So it's like this tiny little hexagonal watch where the lid of it is made out of emerald. The case is made out of emerald. So you have to lift the emerald lid to see this dial inside that's both gilded and covered with green enamel, emerald green enamel. It's just gorgeous. Like, the amount of skill that went into creating that is mind-blowing.
And literally priceless. You couldn't maybe people have put a number on it, but it's just astronomical.
Yeah, I don't know how you'd insure something like that. It's an incredible piece. Unfortunately, although gold does very well underground for hundreds of years, the sort of steels and brass that we use within watchmaking doesn't. So it's not in good enough condition to open it. So you have no idea who made the watch itself. But the case is just spectacular. You can look it up on the internet and find photographs of it. It's magical.
Okay, I will try to remember to put a link to it on the blog post for this episode. And then what fascinates me about this and makes me so happy as a historian is that the first watch that you mentioned that you liked the most was actually a relatively recent one. You could have said, I worked on this 18th century thing that was owned by Samuel Johnson or something. But it's this World War II watch that has this fantastic story with it. And that's what attracts you. So they're not pure antiquarian objects to you. They are things owned by humans who are doing things in their lives, and the watch is part of that life.
Absolutely. And I think that's the really special thing that you get by the time you get to kind of mid 20th century watches, is that we're now in an era where we can share living memories with the original owners, or the original owner has passed that on to their children or grandchildren. So you've got a real tangible link and tangible history that you don't get with something that's kind of 200-300 years old, that's been passed down through several generations or been lost altogether.
Right.
The vast majority of watches that we see, we have no idea. They could have been witness to the most incredible events, and we'll never have any idea because they can't tell us. If I had a magic power, that would be it. I'd make objects be able to talk, which is, that's even more incredible to think about for me sometimes, is that when we get these stories that are so amazing, how many more are there just like that? And that object could be in your hand right now and you would not know.
Yeah,
It's,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. Well, we wanted to keep this a short show because time was short. Get it? Haha. But we want to encourage everyone to go on the Buzzkill bookshelf and get Hands of Time by Dr. Struthers. It really is gripping reading. It's the right mix of discussing the history of watches, but also discussing your work and some great stories of inscriptions you're finding on actually the mechanics on the inside by previous repairers. So you know, for instance, that this was repaired at a certain time by a certain watch repair artisan. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And it's again, it's a great book, Buzzkill. It's on the Buzzkill bookshelf. So go off and get it right now before you run out of time. Oh, I promise not to do that anymore.
It's impossible not to.
It's impossible not to. Okay, Buzzkillers, we will talk to all of you next week.